For the first time in over a decade, we have a brand new Pope, and close to our hearts here at Historical Humans, he is from the great city of Chicago. So that led us to decide to talk about popes today and the papacy and give you some background information, some stories, and to talk about the topic at hand. And we'll also be going through a deep dive on the new Pope's background and his history, so be sure to stay tuned till the end of the video to check that out. But we figured that at the start, we're going to look at the list of popes and all of the different pontifex that have been through history, because there have been, what, 200 and something odd popes?
267th.
Beautiful.
Today, the day we're recording this at least, Leo the 14th became the 267th Pope. And to mark this monumental occasion, we at Historical Humans said we're going to break down the papacy, the popes, how this whole election process works, and who the new guy is, and see how he stacks up a little bit with some of the older fellows, maybe.
And it's interesting too because the list that we'll be taking a peek at shows all 267 popes, as well as the pretenders to the papacy, the anti popes, that were oftentimes appointed by contending powers. And yeah, we're also going to go over the conclave. How do they pick the pope? Dun, dun, dun. Because the second the white smoke goes up over the Sistine Chapel, all heck breaks loose, and that's for darn tootin'. Because that means the process of continuing the head of the Catholic Church, it continues on. So why don't you kick us off now, Colin, and talk about some of your favorites of the popes?
Sure. So the first thing I want to talk about here is specifically with the full list of popes up here. This is the fourth pope of our lifetime here as the hosts of Historical Humans. It's the third conclave we've lived through. And so we've those popes, of course, being John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis, and of course our newest friend now, Leo the 14th. We've papal elections, as you can imagine, typically don't happen very often, especially now that the popes have access to medical care and not a lot of poisonings.
It's
Um,
crazy when the papacy isn't at war that the popes manage to live a while.
yeah, no, even when they're not, where there's a lot of very short reign popes in history. The last short reign pope was John Paul I, who lasted just over a month. Back in 1978. Um, Reigns like John Paul I were very common throughout the Pope's history, and that's because there's a lot of infighting and a lot of political maneuvering that goes into being a pope, especially back in ye olden days when the popes literally ruled central Italy like a nation state.
Yeah, and Pope John Paul I is also interesting because he's the only pontiff to have ever used two names, giving honor to his previous popes that came before him. And then the Pope immediately after him, John Paul II, chose the name because I guess the first one didn't make as great of an impact. Although he did have his mark on the papacy even in his short 33 days, because he abolished the papal coronation and opted for the papal inauguration. So he changed the style of how he actually ascended to that position of power.
Yep. Oh yeah, there's a lot of fun Pope facts just in the lists of Pope. For example, Justin, just shot in the dark here, because we got Leo the 14th on the throne right now. Um, when do you think the last Leo was? There's
I
13 more of them.
I know this exact answer.
I
He
hate
was
you.
in the 1880s and was a huge proponent of social reform, oftentimes backing labor unions, advocating on behalf of the workforce.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. Leo the 13th was crowned on in February of 1878, and he left his position in 1903. Very long reigned pope. So hopefully that continues for the current guy.
Yeah, he's the oldest verified pope in office, dying at 93 years old. So not
Yeah.
only one of the longest reigning popes of history, but a pretty good solid one. And for those of you who are playing at home, he also advocated against communism, which is a pretty common trait amongst pontiffs,
Yeah.
and was the third longest reigning pope after Pius the Ninth, John Paul II, and that does exclude Peter, who is the longest reigning pope ever.
Yeah. 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 Peter lasted a long time.
Yeah. Well, he was an apostle after all.
Yeah. He lived pretty long. But yeah, no, there have been a lot of popes, and oh yeah, there's 267 of them in the 2,000-year history. So all in all, not a bad number. That's just under 10 years per pope. That's almost American presidential levels of average reign.
Yeah.
As what does the math put that at? Let's just put it at 2025 by 267. Yeah, seven and a half years per pope.
I mean, most popes are fairly old when they get elected, though, too, to be fair.
Yeah.
You
Oh
know,
yeah.
my suggestion is vote in like a 35-year-old. And then you got some good, nice long reign. However, with such high turnover in the role, it does lead to new ideas being introduced and basically gives a pretty solid end date for any bad pontiffs.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and you have variable reigns. A lot of the more recent ones have been consistently reasonable. 12 years, 7 years, 26 years, 15 years, a month.
That John Paul, he's just something.
Poor John Paul. Yep. Yeah. John Paul the First really didn't get to uh last very long.
No, and there's some interesting aspects with the papacy that really comes to mind. The first of which is the interregnum period, which lasted from well, the most recent interregnum period, which was from August 29th, 1799 to March 14th, 1800, roughly 6 months. And that was because Pius the 11th died while in prison as a result of the French um was it? Yeah, I think it was a result of the French Revolution because he got arrested by the
Uh,
French.
yeah, it was. I think it was one of their revolutions. It's not the French Revolution everyone thinks of with the guillotines, because that one would have been the 1780s to like 1800, and I think that Pope was about 40 some years later.
No, 1775 to 1799.
Okay, yeah, then they definitely got him.
Yeah, no, they got him. He got
They got him.
got.
Yep. No, yeah, no.
So yeah, a casualty of the French Revolution. Which, if you aren't aware, we do a podcast, and on the podcast episode coming out this coming Monday, we're going to be talking at depth about the French Revolution. Uh, the French and the popes as well. It's a long
Yeah.
lasting
Oh, yeah.
story.
Yeah, there's a lot of anti-popes that resided at a French city called Avignon, back when the popes got very political, and basically the Catholic Church had a civil war.
Yeah, the anti popes really had their work cut out for them.
Which, if you're interested in what that looks like, don't. It's horrible.
It's awful. But you see a lot of common repeating names like Eugene, Benedict, Clement, Innocent. Um, a lot of repeat names: Boniface, Clement. I said Urban, Gregory.
Yep. Yep.
There's been a lot of names, and there's actually only been two popes with a singular name.
No.
The most recent of which was Francis, R.I.P. And can you name the other one, Column?
Yeah. Well, the last one is Lando, but there are several other popes that predate Lando that didn't get a first or a second on their name. But Lando was the last one, all the way back in the year 913. So it was exactly 1100 years between Lando and Francis, where we had popes that refused to take a name that hadn't already belonged to a previous pope.
Well, actually, wouldn't John Paul? I know he borrowed two names of two different previous popes, but he made his
Uh,
own unique version.
John Paul decided he didn't want to break that tradition. So when he anointed him, when he was anointed as pope, he anointed himself John Paul the First.
Oh,
He anointed himself with the one in his name to keep with the tradition of the papal crown always having a number next to it. And he was very quickly justified in this when his successor anointed himself John Paul II.
yeah, which is interesting. You don't often see them take the names in succession like that, but that was a unique case. And
Yeah.
one of the most this was one of the most recent papal conclaves, and it's interesting to me because it also was one of the quickest in history. A
Oh
lot
yeah.
of the papal conclaves in recent dates are a lot quicker than they used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. A modern papal conclave, which is a 20th or 21st century conclave, is typically about 2 to 5 days. This is a stark contrast to a lot of older conclaves and papal elections, some of which had stretched on for months or years.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think the longest was almost 3 full years. It was like 2 years and 8 months.
yeah, yeah. 1268 to 1271, there was a conclave to elect a pope, and that actually resulted in a lot of the reforms that formalized the conclave into what it is today. And then in modern times, the Catholic Church has chosen to present unity over prolonged debate when they make these elections. Or yeah,
And there were a few other changes as well after the 1503 election of Pope Julius II, which was truly the quickest in history, where he was elected the new pope after a conclave that lasted roughly 10 hours in total. So
yeah,
that one was a real quick decision. But after that, they instituted a rule where it was a 10-day and then eventually 15-day waiting period that would have to transpire so that it had time for logistics to get in place, for things, the necessary mechanisms to be set forth. So the conclaves uh, take place a lot later than originally they used to be. But even still, the average conclave since the 1830s has been under 4 days in total, most of which happen between 2 to 3 days. And over the course of those 2 to 3 days, the general expected votership is roughly 4 to 5 ballots in total,
yeah,
which they do 2 ballots in the morning and then 2 ballots in the afternoon, 4 ballots a
yeah.
day.
Yeah. Well, it's well, they don't do 4 ballots a day. It's
Oh, it's one in the
they
morning, one
they
in the
vote
afternoon.
twice per ballot,
Yeah.
and they submit 2 ballots a day. Because how the conclave works is all the cardinals who are eligible to vote are gathered in the Vatican and locked in a room in the Sistine Chapel. And they are not allowed to leave that room until, by the hand of God, they decide who the next pope is. Well, they're in there. They they undergo a series of balloting where they write down the name of the pope that they or the cardinal they want to elect pope on a sheet of paper and place it in a giant cup. And each man does this twice. Those are then read aloud and tallied. And what this does is it allows you to either double down on a candidate or hedge your bets if you're on the fence. It's a nice way to kind of quietly show that, you're uh, open to options or not. And once the ballots have been counted, if a 2/3 majority has been reached, they just burn the ballots and release the new pope into the world. If not, they pour some chemicals in with the ballots and burn them to release black smoke to let everyone know that it's going to be another few hours.
Yeah, that it'll take some time until the next vote and the next pontiff is official. usually
Yeah.
elected.
Yeah, it keeps going until they get that two-thirds majority. For the election of Leo the 14th here, it required a minimum of 89 cardinals to assent to his election, and we don't know how many of them voted for him in that final ballot. The final answer is usually from the church, all of them. It's a unanimous decision because no one knows what happened in there, and it was always unanimous, and it was never not going to be unanimous.
Yeah, they do keep the voting procedures and a lot of the um the rituals surrounding it very private. So I don't think there's ever been outside eyes within the chapel to witness this procedure.
No, electronics are forbidden inside. Outsiders are not permitted. Only uh, screened and assigned aides to the various cardinals are allowed to come and go, and that is usually for the deliverance of food and water, so that you don't just kill all the cardinals. Um, yeah, there's actually an oath of secrecy for the cardinals, where basically, if you explain what happens, or if you talk about anything that happened behind those doors, you are immediately excommunicated from the church, which for a cardinal is a pretty big deal.
Considering by that point you have spent many decades building your profile as a man of faith, as someone who has built their career in the church, and yeah, to risk excommunication over something like that doesn't tend to happen. But what's interesting to me here is Pope
Yeah.
Leo the 14th was selected within 2 days, so it was one of the quicker ones. I'm not sure if it was on the third or fourth ballot in total, but it was fairly quick. Um, and when this pope was selected, it really shocked a lot of people because the general prevailing theory at the time, pretty much up until the time that the pope was announced, many people were trying to figure out who the next pope would be, and there were options from the Philippines, from Ghana. There was a different American cardinal who had been very
Yep.
prominent,
Yep.
along with a couple of Italian options.
Yep. Some Italians, which, fun fact, Italians dominate the papacy because of it being located in the Vatican, inside Rome, inside Italy. In fact, I believe John Paul II was the first non-Italian since the 16th century,
Yeah.
and Pope Francis was the first pope from outside Europe since the 8th century. So, like, that is how centralized this power dynamic has been. That is getting very heavily bucked. Three of the last four popes, including Leo here, are not from Italy.
No, and actually, Pope Leo here is the second pope ever to speak English as a native language, too, by the way.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find the first one who was the English speaker. Trying to figure it out now.
Wait, hey, sorry, correction. All four of the popes from our lifetime, Justin, have been born from outside Italy,
Yes,
because John Paul II was
Polish,
Slavic. Benedict XVI was a German.
German, yeah.
Francis was ethnically Italian, but he was born in Argentina. And Leo the 14th is an American.
Yes. And Adrian the Fourth was the other one that was born in England and the first English speaking pope.
Yeah.
So
Well,
very
I'll go with
interesting.
Adrian the Fourth. That seems very like 12th century.
Yes, it was 1154 to 1159.
Oh yes, I'm getting these right.
But the popes were selected as a result of this, and it's very interesting. They started selecting the popes through the conclave, and they've made a number of reforms to them through the years. But with the selection of Pope Leo, it's very fascinating because the general prevailing theory among many in the faith and theologians believe that America would probably not have a pope for a long time, primarily because it had such a large sphere of influence in politics, and they weren't trying to see a resurrection of the papal states where
Yeah.
the pontiff also had political motivation and certain sovereignty issues.
Yeah.
So,
Which is what led to the whole incident with the anti-popes in Avignon, and it's not a good time. There's a reason why the Vatican has been small and stayed small. It's called Napoleon, and the system is working because for 200 years, uh, we've not gone on some sort of holy war rampage.
so it's always been just generally assumed that there would never be an American pope, and
Yeah.
that's where this really came as a surprise because not only was Leo not considered to be a front runner at the time, he's actually one of the more recent appointees as a cardinal, having just received his appointment in what 2023, 2 years prior to now. However, he was a confidant of Francis and is believed to be set up and ideally going to continue a lot of the work that Francis had done, where Francis had focused a lot on the community and humanitarian aspects of the papacy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely.
And it ties in too with the fact that Leo is the first pope that's a part of the Order of St. Augustine. He's, I think, the fifth pope total to have been an Augustinian, but they focus very heavily on community, on sharing, on these ideals of humanitarian acts through community, through sharing your network.
Yeah. It's a very much a hand to hand sort of based order where it's that direct aid, that common everyday kindness is what is emphasized as holy, as opposed to the more grand gestures often associated with being pope, like edicts and funding and missions and things like that. It's much more of a, you're walking down the street, you've got two hands, help somebody.
Yeah, and that's very interesting, and that to me really stands out, just showing where we are as the world in general. And I really actually, the more I look into it and the more I research it, the more I do actually respect this pick because he very much is a unifier in a lot of ways, where he has his American origins, where he grew up in an Italian Irish family on the south side of Chicago, to being a priest and doing a majority of his religious service in Peru in South America.
Yep.
So he really can reach those extra areas that oftentimes are hyper underrepresented in the grand scheme of things. I mean, Francis was the
Yep.
first American pope in general because he hails from South America.
Yep. Yep.
Leo is the first United States born president or pope,
Oh,
sorry.
yep.
Yes.
Oh no, American presidents aren't Americans. Run.
I mean,
Uh, yeah.
Chicago has the claim of being the only city in the entire world to have both a pope and president come from it now.
Yeah.
And you can't
Yeah.
counter me on that because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Now, one of the fun things here is uh with Leo the 14th, he owes a lot of his eligibility to becoming pope to his predecessor, Pope Francis. In 2015, Francis appointed him as Bishop of Peru, specifically Chiclayo, and he was bishop there for 8 years before Francis promoted him again in 2023 to cardinal. Um, this man worked very closely with his predecessor. He was even summoned to Rome to be prefect of the dicastery for bishops, and which is base this is a big deal. I don't have a lot of the details on this office because, like many things in the Catholic Church, this is, you know, it's an internal holy affair. But effectively, he's in charge of who gets to be appointed to bishop. He's in charge of screening the screening process for that job. Um,
I mean, he's had a very interesting road to the papacy because he started originally with his seminary work in 1977, where he studied with Augustinian fathers, and then at Villanova University in Pennsylvania, where he got a degree in mathematics and studied philosophy. And then he would eventually go on to the novitiate of the Order of St. Augustine, where he would eventually go on to start doing more of the priestly stuff. And in 1981, he took his vows, his solemn vows. And after that, he began receiving additional education. And by 27, he got sent to Rome to study canon law at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is really interesting. And he was officially ordained a priest in 1982 at the Augustinian College of Santa Monica, and would eventually go on to take his dissertation and his doctoral work in Peru, continuing on the Augustinian message.
oh yeah, and like just going back to how linked Leo is to Francis. When Francis was hospitalized in March of 2025 this year, he was chosen to preside over the rosary for his health in St. Peter's Square. And so this was the man that led Catholicism in prayer for the health of the Pope. Like, you know, that's a very high honor to be allowed to lead prayer in the Vatican in the absence of the Pope. Like that is as much of an endorsement as a Pope can give another human being. Mostly because popes die before their successor can be elected.
But it just shows the amount of respect and reveration they had for each other. And I think rightfully so that Leo earned a lot of it because he spent many years working in Peru, working with the Archdiocese of Trujillo as the judicial vicar, and would eventually continue to teach, but would continue to preach and to be a part of that. And then he did eventually return back to Chicago, where he served as the director of formation at St. Augustine Convent. And he basically continued that until Pope Francis appointed him in 2014 to the Peruvian Diocese of Chiclayo. So really had a lot of help raising to the position by Pope Francis. It's fascinating, a man coming from Chicago, and then in 2024 he was made a cardinal and continued climbing the ranks before he was eventually selected. But Pope Leo was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, having been raised in the Dalton neighborhood, and would eventually fall in love with the religion and beliefs, where he would eventually go on to practice the Catholic faith originally. Trying to figure out if they have the name of his church in here, and I don't think they do. But it was located in Dalton. So it's very cool to have the Chicago connection to this Catholic Pope. And something that I find kind of interesting and that I do eventually hope for and hope that he has good work is the list of canonized popes, which is a lot longer than one may think, where 83 of the total 266 deceased popes have been recognized as canonized saints, which 83 of 266, let's see how much that is. 83 divided
It's a pretty big number.
31%.
Yeah. And a big reason why that's such a high percentage is one, it's the holiest office in the land. Two, the first 35 popes were all made into saints because 31 of them were martyred, which is religious speak for murdered by someone who didn't like God.
Well, I wouldn't say that didn't like God, they just didn't like your God.
Yeah. And remember, Catholicism says there's only the one, and it's ours. So it's the statement is internally correct.
Which also very interesting is the fact that Pope Francis canonized three of them.
Yep.
Pope John Paul II, or no, Pope John the 23rd, Pope Paul the 6th, and Pope John Paul II were all
Yep.
canonized by Pope Francis.
Yep.
And then there were a few others that were beatified, which include Pope John Paul I that we talked about previously, also done by good old Pope Francis.
Yep. Yeah. There's a lot of lovely little titles that can get added on to a pope. The highest of them is being declared a saint, um, because that is uh, understandably the highest honor a that the Catholic Church can bestow upon an individual is to declare them a saint.
So that's my long term hope, especially being very biased to Chicago and Dop Hope, is I really do hope that he has a long and successful run as the Pope and has continued the great work that Francis himself had started and to continue promoting this new era of peace and unity and also the empathy that I think a lot of the world has been lacking lately.
Yeah.
I it sounds really dark, but for the first time in a long time, I feel very optimistic about the future, and that's coming from someone who is not a practicing Catholic.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably a great point for us to wrap this episode up. Let us know what you guys think down below. And yeah, we'd love to hear your insight as to the newest pope in the world. And we'll see you guys in the next one.